All right, it's 6:30 in the evening in my clock, so we're going to begin. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to what is the first of a series of 3 conversations discussing the ideas of liberalism, free markets, and open societies, for which we at Takshashila are delighted to be partnering with the Niskanen Center. I'm Manoj Kewalramani. I'm a research fellow at Takshashila. I usually focus on a place that's not as free or liberal, which is China. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I just want to sort of begin by setting a tone of why we're talking about what we're talking about. Over the past few years, there's been a deepening trend of polarized politics and economic nationalism around the world. Increasingly, we've seen political discourse become shrill and socio-political fissures stymie the functioning of legislatures and even lead to violence in democracies. This has been the case in India. This has been the case in the US, the world's oldest and the world's largest democracy. These trends, particularly including the skepticism with regard to economic globalization, have probably accelerated amid the pandemic. We've heard of talk about decoupling economies, deglobalization, and more recently, a backlash against immigrants, whether they be students or whether they be economic migrants. And we've seen that sort of escalate amid the pandemic. In this sort of a scenario, the ideas of liberalism, moderation, open societies, and free market economics, which have all sort of led to the boom that we've experienced through much of our lifetimes, have come under severe attack. Now, although it might not appear right now because all of us are probably cooped in our homes for the past few months, but this pandemic is a transient event. It will pass. Yet the impact that it's having on the value systems that we've cherished and that have helped us prosper is likely to be much more long lasting. And therefore, it's critical for democracies like India and the United States to have these conversations, to sort of go back to the kind of things that have let us prosper. So therefore, we think that these discussions around the ideas of liberalism, free markets, and open societies are of urgent importance. And as the world emerges from this pandemic and drifts to a new order of sorts, it's important to sort of re-emphasize these. So with that sort of context laid out, let me just take a minute to introduce Takshashila and Niskanen Center for the benefit of those who may be unaware. The Takshashila Institution is a center for research in education and public policy. We are physically located in Bangalore, India, but have been operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. So in some ways, we were very prepared for this pandemic in terms of switching around. As an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we are engaged in discussing India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed, and exploring new issues at the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. It bears mentioning that, I'm mentioning this because it's pertinent to today's conversation, that Takshashila's work is rooted in the values of freedom, openness, tolerance, pluralism, and responsible citizenship. And these are values that we vigorously advocate. And given these values that we espouse, we are absolutely proud to partner with the Niskanen Center for this conversation. The Niskanen Center is a non-partisan think tank founded in 2015 in Washington, DC. Among the issue areas that it focuses on are immigration, climate, healthcare, poverty, and welfare. The Niskanen Center works to advance an open society by direct engagement in the policymaking process and through the courts with amicus briefs and pro bono representation. With that done, let me welcome the 2 panelists for today's session, and they'll be talking about the future of liberal democracies. First, Wilkinson, the Vice President of the Niskanen Center, and Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of the Takshashila Institution. Before I hand over to them, just a brief note on house rules. We'll be beginning with opening remarks from both Will and Nitin. Following that, I'll be invoking the moderator's privilege to pose questions to each of them. But this is going to be a participatory process, so I would love for you to participate and support me in this. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, or if you're watching live, a sort of live stream on YouTube, you can ask a question there and share your thoughts there too. Feel free to post as many questions as you'd like, and as soon as you think of them, there's no need to wait. And the wonderful team that's working in the background, supporting me in this process, will help me in picking them up. So without further delay, I want to invite both the panelists. Will, let me begin with you. Please help us kickstart the session with your opening remarks.
Hi, well, Thank you. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about liberal democracy with you guys. I want to admit at the outset that I know very little about Indian politics, so I'm hoping to learn something. I have, my own theories about what's been going on in the United States. I suspect that it has a relationship to what's going on in other places, but I have no idea how well it applies. Here in the US, liberal democracy is not doing well. We elected Donald Trump. He's not been the best for either liberal values or democratic values. When he got elected, I was, exasperated and depressed. And like many people, I was like, what the heck happened? And I dug into the question of what happened, and I came up with a slightly different answer than most people. So about this time last year, I published a paper called Density Divide, Urbanization, Polarization, and Populist Backlash. And there I offer a theory of polarization and the rise of illiberal populism as a sort of long-term consequence of urbanization. And I know that sounds pretty strange to some people, but the idea is that over, first of all, like the kind of the biggest fact of the social world all over the world is urbanization. It's this huge glacial transition of the world's population from the countryside to dense urban centers. And this is happening absolutely everywhere. And, in India, in spades, you've got much bigger cities than we have here. But the idea is that over time, the whole population is drifting toward the city because of the economic incentives of that the city offers. Like it's where the economy is increasingly centered, but people don't have the same inclination to move or migrate. So over time, the population starts to sort on the attributes that predict whether or not you're going to migrate or urbanize. And what led me in the first case to that hypothesis was seeing in the United States how in our two-party system, the two parties are now almost entirely split on population density. The more dense the population, the higher the Democratic vote share. The less dense, the higher the Republican vote share. And that just struck me as a really crazy thing. Now, I don't want to give a précis of the whole paper, but the overall idea is that, in particular in the United States, we have this, first past the post, winner take all electoral system. It's heavily biased. Our constitutional system is heavily biased toward less populated, lower density states. Those states are heavily Republican. The populations of those states taken together comprise a shrinking minority of the nation's population. But those people, the base of the Republican Party is almost entirely white, slightly older, less educated, and is more likely to live in the countryside or in the exurbs. And that class of people are a class of people who've historically been very privileged in our society, have historically been very wealthy in our society. But as economic growth becomes more and more and more concentrated in big cities, those places have been stagnating. And there is a kind of rising resentment of the fact that their expectations for their material comfort isn't being met, for the fear that their cultural power is being swamped. And they're on the edge of the biases in our system that allow them to hold power with a minority. Those are slipping away, right? And so there's been this incredible reaction where the right in the US has basically been attacking democratic institutions, because if we have a well-functioning democracy, it means that basically the constituents of the Republican Party will lose power. And so there is this big backlash against the city, against the multicultural dynamism that they see as part of the city. And there is a backlash against democratic institutions insofar as they threaten the preeminence of older white, more rural Republicans. So I'll just cut it off there. I already talked too long, but maybe that's a good place to start.
All right, Nitin?
Yeah, thanks, Manoj, and thanks, Will, for starting this off. I'm absolutely delighted to initiate this partnership with the Niskanen Center, because we're exploring the contemporary and future importance of the values that we stand for, both Niskanen and Takshashila. I think the convergence is on liberty, rule of law, free markets, and open societies. And our conversations over the next 3 weeks are going to cover many of these aspects. At a time our states and our societies face these immense challenges, I think both Niskanen and Takshashila want to be unapologetic advocates of these values. This is what we stand for, and this is what the two countries can do together in the world in the years to come. That sort of is the leitmotif of what we're trying to do. Today, I just want to make the argument that the current shadow or the eclipse of liberal democracy that we are seeing is because of this transition into the information age. So what Will says is a part of that. It's the geographical, physical part of that. But there is also this online, virtual, technological part of that, where everybody in the world and everybody every adult in both our countries has a mobile phone and is connected with to everybody else all the time. In fact, it's 24/7, extremely low cost, pervasive connectivity. And that has rewired the way our societies operate. So, but I also want to argue that this is something that we will emerge out of sooner or later. And it requires us to do the hard work of educating new generations on the values of what a free society stands for. Now, the polarization of the discourse, rise of populism, backlash, I think it's happening in the US, it's happening around the world, it's happening in India as well. It's really an unintended, unanticipated consequence of the proliferation of the internet. Those of us who are on the net, 25, 30 years ago used to say that, hey, this is going to be a force for the good. Imagine everyone in the world is going to be connected to everyone. What a wonderful world it will be. And here we are. Everyone is connected to everyone else. And it doesn't seem to be the kind of a wonderful world we thought it would be. But it can get there. Right? So it's probably a phase of turbulence that we have to cross before we get to a much better world. I'm optimistic about that. But what is interesting is that I think there's growing awareness that there's a problem, both among civil societies, thoughtful people in the United States, thoughtful people in India, the leadership of the technology companies, regulators, and even people who are in the political, riding the political wave. I think there is a sense that we've got to be able to handle, handle the consequence of the information age. But unlike, viruses and spam, these two big, these are the problems of the 90s. There's going to be computer viruses, we're going to destroy everything, spam is going to kill us. But we managed those problems pretty well over the last 20 years. But unlike those problems, this is going to be a little harder to crack. Why? Because I think what's happening is that online engagement and the television that it spawns and the mass media that it spawns is really amplifying our fast thinking brains, our fast brains all the time. We're jumping from instinct to instinct to instinct to instinct, and we just don't have the time to step back and sort of think and use our slow brains, right? And what this does is it perpetuates biases instead of overcoming biases, right? I mean, the whole idea of liberal democracy is that you're able to expand your moral arc and understand, who the other person is and what's happening in the other side. So the engine we had to overcome our biases is sort of floundering because of the way social proof works on the internet. And the second reason, I think, is market-based, because the business model of all the technology companies really depends on this fast-moving, fast brain, jumping from instinct to instinct kind of a thing. Your advertising, etc., goes in, and you want things to go viral, right? You don't really care whether it's fake news or real news. You don't really care whether it's bigotry or really great, profound wisdom, as long as it's spreading, right? So the business models of the technology platforms benefit from this. But a lot of people are horrified, right? And both sides, I wouldn't say both sides, there are many sides to this. All sides are recognizing the dangers of where this is headed, right? There's populism, and what seems to be the opposition to populism is another kind of populism, right? And I think people are sort of understanding where this is headed. So a combination of, I would say, legislative action, regulatory action, consumer revolt, shareholder activism, and market forces, I think will exert the countervailing forces on where we are headed and sort of bring us back onto the path of reasonable civil discourse. And reasonable civil discourse, public reason, is going to take us into a democratic society. Now, I just want to talk about a couple of minutes on the 21st century being right now, the world situation is where there's a battle for models. This is very similar to the first decades of the 20th century. There are different countries prospering on different kinds of models, and there seems to be a contest of models. Are you going to go the China way, which is, the Beijing model, or the liberal democratic model? So I think we have been in India, and I think we've been, and as Will confess, he doesn't know much about Indian politics. I don't know much about US politics, but I suspect that it's the same case in the US, that we've taken liberal democracy for granted. We thought that it's, the virtues of liberal democracy are self-evident. Everybody sort of buys them, and there's no need to talk about them to our own people, right? But I think it's not self-evident. And I think the case has to be made every generation. The broadest purpose of education, from the Greek democracies to what Jefferson was saying. I know a little more about Jefferson's era than contemporary US politics, but I think what Jefferson and others were saying, and in fact, the University of Virginia was founded on the idea that you need educated people to operate the levers of democracy. You can't just, throw in a constitution and expect that it would work, but you need people, both citizens, administrators, political leaders, media people, who understand and make this thing work. And it's the same in Ambedkar as well. Ambedkar, who gave us the Indian Constitution, said more or less the same thing. Constitutions are not necessarily good or bad. It's about the people who make them work. And I think the idea there is we've got to now get into this business of sharing the ideas, propagating these ideas, standing up for these ideas of liberal democracy. I just want to end on one note. It's not that the price of liberty is not necessarily only eternal vigilance, but I think it's eternal education. So we've got to go out and talk about liberal democracy. Why is it important? It's not just an instrumental thing. In India, it's common to say that liberal democracy will give us economic growth. So what if it doesn't? Even if democracy doesn't give us high economic growth, it's something which is intrinsic to our civilization. So that's something we have to be fighting for. I'll just end there.
All right. So both of you have touched on things that I want to sort of take further. The first thing that I wanted to sort of ask you, both of you, and probably beginning with Will, because I'm sort of going to the US, because this is what we are seeing currently in the US, but we've experienced this in India in the last 6-7 years. The idea that populism and social divisions that are sort of emerging right now, there's a lot of historical grievances that are being addressed today, and that have sort of come to the fore today. If democracies and liberal democracies were a model which allowed over a period of time for different sort of people from different backgrounds, different interest groups to negotiate and therefore sort of arrive at sort of more harmonious or at least balanced outcomes, that's what democracies were, as compared to sort of authoritarian regimes where fissures are sort of clamped down on. How are we seeing these grievances return? Is it a failure of the model of liberal democracies that they were unable to address some of these grievances? Is there something sort of a deeper problem that we need to think about going forward?
That's a great question. Let me see if I can address that while also saying a thing or two about some of Nitin's comments. so the way I see, Nitin has said that we need to see the values of liberal democracy not as just entirely instrumental, as like in terms of economic growth. It's true that liberal democracies do better in terms of economic performance, and that's a very nice thing, a good reason to support it, but it's not the most important thing. Like the most important thing is liberty in the first instance, but because that is the condition for civil peace, social stability, a certain kind of order that people need to be able to plan and flourish. That's why it produces economic growth. But like my emphasis, what I've come to see the value of democracy is more like what you're saying, Manoj. It has to do with making sure that every group of people in society has a mechanism to bring their grievances, their demands, their desires, their preferences to the table, and to negotiate over those things through a peaceful, deliberative mechanism. And one of my favorite social theorists is an Indian, Amartya Sen, and he's got a wonderful theory about justice, which I agree with, which is that who knows what ideal justice is? Nobody, like we can debate about it all day, but there really isn't that much disagreement about what counts as injustice, right? Like we all recognize that the guy with the boot on his neck is being treated unjustly. In the US, we understand that police are disproportionately shooting and killing Black Americans and not white Americans. Nobody has a hard time seeing that that is unjust. And so when we see that injustice, the important thing is to rectify it. That's how we make progress. It's not that we aim toward some ultimate ideal of justice and try to reshape our institutions to fit that ideal. It's just that we look at all the injustices one by one, and try to eliminate them serially. And then you just end up with a more just society. And liberal democracy is the mechanism that allows you to do that. But it's not necessarily working, and for a couple of reasons. One of our first questions is, has democracy as a form of government plateaued? We're still going through a growth phase. In the US, at least, we've just never gotten there. Our democracy is still very incomplete. So, Black voters' rights to participate in the political process weren't secured until, just a few years before I was born. There's still systematic racial disenfranchisement. There's all sorts of barriers to participation built into our system. Our criminal justice system is incredibly unfair in racial terms, and we tend to take voting rights away from felons or people who've been imprisoned, but that is effectively a way of stripping the vote from a vulnerable population of people. So we just don't have a very good, robust democracy. Our institutions aren't very representative. One of the things that I draw out in my paper on the density divide is that the mismatch in the United States between our constitutional democratic order and the distribution of the population is getting worse and worse and worse, because the population is becoming more and more concentrated in urban areas. And that's making it so that multicultural cities are less and less and less represented by our democratic institutions, even though they amount to an increasing proportion of the population. There's something perverse about that. And it allows for the domination of much more diverse, multicultural urban populations by a much more homogeneous, less urban population. And so that's just our democracy not working, because it's not structured the way a democracy ought to be. It's not fairly representative. And that makes it so that our system isn't really responsive to the demands of voters. And when a democratic system just stops being responsive, just doesn't do what people want. I mean, for example, like 80–90% of the American population wants some sort of some moderate gun control measures, but they never happen due to the way certain constituencies can dominate the democratic process, despite being a very small minority of the population. And so the system keeps not delivering the results that the population wants, and it's no surprise that people grow disaffected and alienated over time. But I don't think that means that democracy doesn't work. It means that we're not democratic enough, and that's why it's not working.
Nitin, do you want to add to that?
See, I think one of the, it was very enlightening to hear what Will said about the US. I think the Indian story is slightly different. And those of you who are tuning in from the US, you might be surprised to know that the Indian Constitution enshrined social revolution in its DNA. So when India became independent, the Constitution of India was not just a manual for running government as the US Constitution is, defining the roles of the duties, the liberties of the citizen and the role of the state. That's a very minimalist interpretation of what a constitution is. The India's maximalist interpretation really is about changing the order of Indian society. Deep inequities which we had for thousands of years was sought to be overturned through a constitutional method, right? So the constitutional, revolution really promotes social justice, and that's there from the beginning, right? So universal adult franchise, making untouchability and the caste system an illegal thing from day one, etc., etc. So we are we are living a revolution, right? And a lot of us don't really understand that. They don't understand the idea why there is a certain kind of an underlying political and social ferment in our constitutional processes, because that's by design, right? That's by design. You're trying to reverse, hundreds or thousands of years of inequity using an instrument called the Constitution, which was put in place in 1950, right? And you're trying to use legislative means to do that. And that also has its own consequences, because a lot of people look at it and say, look, we've been doing this, we've been living our lives according to these rules for the last 100 or 200 or 500 years. And who are you guys with a new book called the Constitution coming and telling us what to do, right? And so that tension has been playing out for the last 70 years. But I know when Will said a lot of things, the thing which came to my mind is, hey guys, we have the similar kind of problems, not exactly the same, but we have similar kinds of problems. But what is interesting between the US and India is that we have this fantastic tradition of navel gazing and understanding our failings, really ripping them apart and sharing it in front of, the whole world. We're not shy to share the shortcomings of our political systems with each other, but it's an entirely different story you get when you talk to let's say the Chinese, right? Manoj, you know this. You go and ask a person on a public forum or even a private conversation, what exactly is wrong with the Chinese system? You'll probably get one or two very anodyne kind of responses, and then it ends there. But I think one of the strengths that democratic systems have, whether it's the US or whether it's US or India, is the ability to be transparent about the faults. And one of the things which worries me is when the transparency starts getting translucent and then opaque, right? So we've got to be, very, very careful about that. As long as we're transparent, the warts and all, we show off our failings, we show off our faults, and we can fix them at one time or the other. When we start hiding them is when the trouble starts.
Right. I mean, you speak of China, and it sort of reminds me of recently reading pieces which talked about the protests in the US and talking about how, so in one part of Africa, a square had been renamed. And the Chinese talked about how this is a broad swath of historical injustices sort of done by the West on Africans. Yet they wouldn't sort of acknowledge the fact that the only reason why the square is being renamed and this movement is today a global movement is because there were protests in the US. And those protests then sort of caught on. It's that system which allowed this, which would never really happen in China. So yeah, I totally get that argument. I want to move a little bit forward with another question that we have, and I want to sort of club it with a question that I have. The question on the group is, under the garb of nationalism, are we moving towards surrendering our rights with respect to technology? And I want to add to this. Throughout this pandemic, what we've seen is that increasingly, in some ways, the state has returned into people's lives in more ways than one, whether it be in terms of surveillance, whether it be in terms of just public health delivery, or whether it be in terms of contact tracing and the rest of it. How does that fundamentally alter the sort of the social contract that we've had in liberal democracies, where the objective has been to sort of, in some ways, limit the coercive capacity of the state? And what's happening in the last couple of months is that increasingly the state is gaining more sort of positions where it can coerce individuals going forward. At the moment, that might be useful, but going down the road, it might be problematic. So how do we sort of tackle this? Firstly, from the point of view of technology companies, are we sort of giving up our rights to companies? And then with regard to the state. Will, can I begin with you?
Yeah, great question. Again, I think this is a hard one. I'm not sure exactly what our rights with respect to technology are, or whether they've been defined correctly in the first place. So it's hard to have a strong opinion about the trend. I think a lot of the problems that we're having, some of the polarization and divisiveness of social media, comes from the business model of Twitter and Facebook being based on engagement and clicks, because they have an advertising based business model, and that is all about being able to use and sell people's data to target advertisements to them. And I'm not sure, and I'm sure that we have disagreements about this, like even within Niskanen. I tend to think that people ought to have rights to data, to control over the data about their person, and that companies need to get people's actual consent and possibly pay them to use data about themselves. And I think that would solve some of these problems. So part of the problem is that I don't think we have defined rights correctly around some of our technology. I think the definition of property rights around personal data would be very, very useful. It would create new markets, and would help maintain people's privacy, and not make them so subject to the kind of demographic baiting that people get through social media, thanks to the advertising model. The question about whether the state is becoming more or less coercive, clearly new technology, information technology, gives the state as well as private sector actors, new tools to surveil people, to follow them. I know some people in Silicon Valley who run these, location tracking businesses where they bundle cell phone data to see patterns of movement. And the business model is, they sell this data to, businesses that want to know the ideal place to locate, and so they're looking at those traffic patterns. But it's exactly the same thing that can be used to identify a coalescing protest and crush it before it starts. And I am very, very worried about that sort of thing, which is why I tend to be a, kind of a privacy maximalist. I've been working a lot recently on policy around fighting the coronavirus, and I tend to be very skeptical of some of the plans to do surveillance through cell phone apps, because I'm not confident that that kind of technology won't be abused in the future. But at the same time, what the problem that we're having in the United States with respect to our response to the virus isn't from the state being too powerful or too good. it's from a kind of just breakdown of state capacity, right? We're seeing that we need the state to solve collective action problems that individual actors in the private sector can't solve itself. And we're, up to around 140,000 Americans have died. That's more than, a bunch of recent wars combined, right? It's an absolute tragedy, and it's directly attributable to the undermining of the competency and capacity of the state to function effectively at some of its core purposes. So just as I'm worried about the state using technology to dominate and undermine the liberty of citizens on the one hand. I'm also worried about the weakness of the state in terms of fulfilling some of its core functions. And I think Americans are dying by the droves because American state capacity is failing.
Nitin?
See, I think the good news for India was that the COVID came after a landmark Supreme Court judgment which determined that privacy is a fundamental right of citizens. And the government is enjoined by court and by law to come out with a privacy law which will define many of these things. But the philosophical point really is that the social contract in terms of how much of that data and the rights over that data belong to you, and how much of the rights over that data can be appropriated by the state. I think that negotiation is still going on. It's by no means complete in the United States or in India or any other part of the world, including Europe. But I think here's the interesting part. The risk is not so much that we will make a wrong decision in terms of where the balance lies, but the risk is that we'll willy-nilly end up in a fait accompli because we adopt certain technologies or adopt certain products or certain features or buy into certain apps, and lo and behold, you've realized that you've completely doxed all of all your data belongs to somebody else, right? So I think the risk of ending up there is really, really serious at this time. It could be due using contact tracing apps. It could be due to video apps, which people make videos out of and share with each other. It could be due to an app like Truecaller. There are hundreds of ways this can happen, and you might end up in a situation where you've already bartered the rights. The question is, it's moot. So I think it's very important now I like what Bill said, to be extremely on the ball on this, to be hawkish in the protection of privacy, hawkish in the protection of individual rights, because governments in the time of pandemics are really panicking, right? It's not just the US government or the Indian government. Governments around the world are panicking. And in panic, they might put in place acts or legislation that are horrific. I'll give you an example. The Epidemic Diseases Act, which was legislated in India in 1896 by the British government then, the British colonial government, put in place the Epidemic Diseases Act in 1896 because there was a plague outbreak. And that act basically says that if the government declares an epidemic, any agent of the state has literally infinite amount of powers, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So that was a panic reaction in 1896, and it gave us that act. Mercifully, nobody's decided to declare epidemics every now and then and take out our fundamental rights. But it's possible, it's really possible that for aspiring dictators, here's a simple way: declare an epidemic. But more seriously, I think we've got to be able to prevail over this panic reaction, and all the more reason for us to be hawkish about protecting privacy rights and individual liberty.
All right, I'm going to pick up another question from the Q&A box. Pranay asks, and Nitin, I want to start with you on this. Who, according to the two of you, should be at the center of liberal democracy? Should it be the individual? Should it be a disadvantaged group? Or should it be a majority consensus? Nitin?
See, I'm biased in this. I'm a child of the Enlightenment, and I only see the individual at the center of society, right? Liberties belong to the individual, rights belong to the individual, freedom belongs to the individual. The collective, I think Brian Kaplan said this very nicely once, where he said that I don't want to be a member of any group which I did not voluntarily sign up to, right? So you just can't assume that collectives have rights the same way as individuals do.
Will?
I'd put it a little bit differently. Like when we're talking about liberal democracy, you've got kind of two elements there. Like the liberal part is about the rights that individuals have, right? So there's a difference between, just a unchecked majoritarianism, right? So what makes a liberal democracy liberal is usually that there's a charter or bill of rights that puts some constraints on what democratic majorities can do, right? So, the First Amendment in the United States makes it so that the legislature just can't legislate, your religion away or your right to have your say away, right? Like so, so the function of charters and bills of rights are to protect the rights of the individual, and that is the appropriate and rights do inhere in individuals and not groups. But the democracy part of liberal democracy is inevitably about collective action by groups that have some shared some sort of shared interest. And increasingly, and this is why I think polarization has gotten hot in the United States, like increasingly, like parties are coalescing around identity, about people's race, people's level of education, urban rural stuff, right? Like there just are groups of people. And one of the main functions I see for democracy is this kind of self-defense, like along the same lines as Amartya Sen's emphasis on rooting out injustice rather than aiming toward ideal justice. I'm a big fan of Judith Sklar's idea of the liberalism of fear, that the main function of liberal institutions is to minimize cruelty, harm, the violation of basic rights. And democracy is a mechanism in which, because usually oppression and subjugation is something that happens not individual, but to individual, but by groups. India has had the caste system. The United States has had a official slavery, and then like an official brutal apartheid system that's based on race, and so it is groups that tend to be oppressed and who tend to have their rights denied due to the characteristics that make them members of those groups. And so I think it's very important to see democracy as a mechanism through which groups who've been denied basic rights, whose interests aren't reflected, can use to defend themselves against other groups who might want to do them harm.
All right. I'm going to take one more question on things related to individual rights, particularly regarding social issues, before I will move to economic issues and free markets, because that's another value that we've not touched upon so far. So the last question that I wanted to take on this was from Atish. It's an interesting question. He talks about the understanding of the notion of liberalism in India and the United States. Isn't that sort of fundamentally different about how we see that term and how liberal democracy is practiced in India and how it's practiced in the US? And he sort of asks in the context of public trust in government and the state. I wanted to first get your sense on that, Nitin. India, at present also, Indians tend to have a very high, the approval ratings for the present government is extremely high. Generally, our first instinct is to go look at the state in case of any issues. So is liberalism understood differently within these two countries? Is there a sort of shared understanding of it, or is it horses for courses?
Yeah, I know. First of all, I think the issue of constitutions, I think there's a lot in the Indian constitution that has been inspired by the US Constitution and discussions with constitutional experts in the early 20th century. So there are connections in terms of constitutional connections, but in terms of the Indian attitude towards the state, it's a little paradoxical, because on the one hand, an average Indian would expect a lot of the state to provide a lot of services. Think that the state is the best agency to do this and to do that and produce soaps and produce detergents and so on. And we do have a soap company. The government of one of the Indian governments runs a soap. At least one Indian government runs a soap company. I'm sure there are many others as well. But also, if you ask an Indian an opinion about the performance of the state in its ability to deliver some of these things, you always get a negative. The schools are bad, the hospitals are bad, and the roads are bad, and the water supply is bad, and the electricity supply is bad. So there is a paradoxical view that the state is somehow supposed to do this, but that the state is not capable of doing this. So somehow you sort of muddle through the two. But I think we've got to separate popularity of the government of the day or the prime minister of the day from the attitude towards the state. And I don't think they've always been the same, nor are they same even at this time.
Will? I can't comment at all on Indians' attitude toward the state. It's interesting, like take it as a whole. Americans have right now, like historically, one of the lowest opinions of the state ever. Like just in terms of like, is your view of Congress positive or negative? Is your view of this or that? You're like, its sentiment is very negative. But if you unbundle it, in terms of specific agencies and specific functions, it looks quite a bit different, right? So Americans have a very positive attitude towards the U.S. military, for instance. There's a medium attitude towards like the Postal Service, and people have very varying attitudes towards their local governments, depending on their quality. So it's really more varied than you might think, but I think the overall view has gotten very negative, and partly for the reasons I mentioned before. Just government has become decreasingly responsive to the public will. We have a system that is more and more feels to be more and more corrupt and captured by powerful economic interests, by professional associations, by all of these organized interests, kind of lock up the system to protect their special privileges and rents. And that just makes it so that the system doesn't work for ordinary people. And so that just creates a exasperation and frustration that ends up, producing an overall generally extremely negative attitude toward the government.
All right. So like I said, I want to move to issues of economics, and you've sort of touched upon those right now. But sort of broadly, just let's look beyond our national boundaries. Let's look at the world at large right now. We see a massive churn that's taking place in the international order. It's very difficult to pin down what the order is right now because it's still emerging in some ways. But from an economic point of view, what we're seeing is that increasingly immigration is unwelcome. Even economic immigration at this point of time with the pandemic, given the nature of economies around the world, is increasingly unwelcome. We've seen this recent controversy in the US with regard to international students. Other than that, we are seeing the global trading system essentially sort of begin to sort of show serious cracks, to put it mildly. And we're talking about deglobalization, where countries are looking at broadening the definition of what national security entails from an economic perspective, what is a strategic sector, and so on and so forth. How do you conceptualize a liberal international trading order in such an environment? What are the challenges, and what should we be doing to sort of mitigate some of the threats to this order? Will, I want to begin with you.
There's been I think right now we're going through a serious, on the one hand, politically, there's been a backlash to the last phase of globalization. Just like on the whole, it's been sort of a boon for humanity. Like more people have risen out of poverty over the past generation than at any other point in human history. That's great. And globalization and trade are largely responsible for that, for bringing the productive potential of countries that had been less developed online, making them more prosperous. But at the same time, there's been a lot of distributive effects in a lot of places due to the offshoring of manufacturing and trade. That's been a problem here in the U.S. My colleague Sam Hammond has a wonderful paper on the China shock, and just the effect that gutting American manufacturing capacity and moving it to China has had on the American economy and politics. But I think there are other deeper elements to the revaluation of globalization that we haven't got our heads around quite yet. One of my favorite recent papers is by Henry Farrell of George Washington University and another scholar, and it's called Weaponized Interdependence. And it talks about the way in which the global financial system has become more integrated through globalization, but that has created a network through which illiberal regimes can influence liberal regimes, right? Like, so in the United States, we have lots of Russians and Saudis on corporate boards and on, and they influence our politics in an illiberal direction, in a way that I think people don't really quite understand. And that is a knock-on effect of increasing global economic interdependence. The integration of the world order, like we all assumed, I think liberals assumed that globalization was going to make the rest of the world more liberal. And it has on some dimensions, but it's also created this, through the exact same channels, opportunities for liberal countries to make liberal countries less liberal. For instance, like I find it crazy, like NBA players, the National Basketball Association, they're very socially conscious. They'll say, they'll stand up and make, comments about race, but they're contractually prohibited from saying anything negative about China. Right? They're going to lose their job if they say anything about the, Uyghur genocide, right? And that's because of the economic influence of China. Like that market is so huge. The NBA, it's a huge, profit center for them now. And the Chinese government can unilaterally just cut them off. So, they've gagged themselves in order to have access to this illiberal market. And I think that's a really big problem that we've yet to really grapple with fully.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Nitin?
Yeah, I'm not going to steal the thunder of the panel, which is going to come, the webinar which is going to happen next week with Anupam and co. But, I just want to state that India's prosperity lies in an open global system. We need the world to be open to ideas. We need the world to be open to capital, trade, goods, services, and people. This is the only way India can prosper. So I think it's in India's interest, whatever be the challenges which are out there, it's in India's interest to go out and fight for this world and aggressively fight for this world at a time when the rest of the world seems to have lost faith. India always seems to be out of phase on this, Everybody is talking about globalization. We're wondering, hey, do we want to get onto this bus? And then everyone says the bus is off, no ticket guys. We say, hey, we want to get onto the bus because that works for us. But being less flippant about it, I think it's very, very important for us to do it. I think one of the things, at the cost of oversimplifying, what actually seems to have happened is that a lot of the economic pain that Western people in Western countries are suffering is because of manufacturing having shifted to China. But somehow they are blaming this on the immigrants who've come into those countries. It's not the immigrants that are the problem. It's the problem is, as Will said, an unthinking and poorly managed process of outsourcing manufacturing to China. I mean, here you are with your pharmaceutical supply chains depending on China. You can't get antibiotics if the Chinese don't want to send you those antibiotics. I mean, India has some of that, but I believe the US doesn't. So whoever did this, right? I think that who did this? The market did this, but I suppose the incentives for the market to do this were not really overseen properly. And I think that's the kind of rebalancing that needs to happen at this time.
All right, we have about 6.5 minutes to go, and I want to take a couple of more questions. First, Will, to you, Matt Warner is asking, what are the implications? What were the implications with regard to foreign aid and spreading liberal democracy abroad via foreign aid? He says, Krastev and Holmes say that we have inspired resentment towards liberalism, not because of the idea of liberalism, but because of the way it has spread as something to imitate rather than authentic homegrown set of institutions. I'd like you to talk about this a little bit.
I'm not sure I captured the entire question. So like, in the past, U.S. foreign policy is very much centered on making U.S. aid, conditional on reforms that bring systems a little bit more in a liberal democratic direction. Trump has ended that completely. He does not care if you're a liberal democracy. He kind of likes you better if you don't want to be one. But I think there has been a lot of backlash to that. Like the United States and Americans are just oblivious. We're, I think, in some ways, one of the most insulated and narcissistic and parochial nations on earth. We're just like, we just don't ever see the rest of the world. And so Americans tend not to understand what their reputation is in other countries, and tend not to see how much like resentment there can be toward meddlesome US influence. And so I sometimes think these efforts are self-defeating, that when you interfere in other people's systems in a kind of way that's felt to be bullying or coercive, your own commitment to the values you espouse seem insincere. And I think that's been a real problem. But like, in a more like direct and overt way, the United States just like invading and occupying Iraq and trying to just, like force it to become a liberal democracy is one of the most misguided political endeavors in my lifetime. It just like betrays this incredible arrogance. I'm a huge fan of Hayek, and talks about the fatal conceit, that the idea that you can just engineer a society to produce justice, right? And that's what the United States tried to do. We just took over an entire country. I mean, like the leadership was bad. Nobody thinks Saddam Hussein was great, but like we just like violated this country's sovereignty. It did nothing to us, and just tried to make it into a liberal democracy without doing anything to cultivate the values of democracy. So I do think it's true that these values have to bubble up organically. And the best thing we can do is to try to make the case for liberal democratic values as clearly and forcefully as we can, and make it accessible to people all around the world. And to take that message to other countries and hope that their activists take hold of it and start spreading it within their own communities, because it's not going to take hold unless it comes out of the community itself. We can't pester people into our values. They have to discover them and embrace them on their own. And I think America has been pretty arrogant and bad at really, understanding that and acting like we understand it.
Yeah, Nitin, I just wanted to sort of very quickly, there's also criticism of India that usually gets spoken of, that India doesn't put values at the center of its foreign policy more so of late, and that India should be actually advocating more for democracy. Your thoughts on that?
See, first of all, just quickly in the few seconds that I have, I want to disagree with Will to some extent. I would just say that the US did not fund liberal democracy enough. A lot of the US money was in the pursuit of foreign policy interests, and it went into supporting very, very terrible regimes because it served the geopolitical interests better. So I think there is a case for the US to promote liberal democracy a lot more around the world, because it both has the resources and the sort of value system to do that. Whether it's India or whether it's the US, I think the idea that you can foreign ideas won't work is not entirely true. You can import the ideas, the technology of liberal democracy, and the mechanisms of it and the values of it anywhere in the world, and they would work. Because what's wrong with individuals being free? I mean, what's unusual about individuals not having their rights taken away from them? What's wrong in individuals not having a choice of profession, or to do what they want to do, to marry who they want to, or whether they want to or not, right? So freedom, I think, as a underlying DNA, is universal. It's a question of whether we want to promote a particular variation of that freedom or a particular model or not. That I think is an issue. I think India has been doing what it can, but I think we have to be very, very conscious of the power that we command, right? You can't, if you try and preach values and try to impose systems which are beyond your national power, you don't get anywhere. So I think the question really is, how does India accumulate power very, very quickly through economic power, raise your per capita income from $2,000+ a year to $10,000+ a year in a generation, and then you're in a better position to sort of reshape the world in the way that you want to.
All right, we're just about out of time, but I'm going to take one last question, which will tie into the final comments that I want to give you all 30 seconds to sort of make. This is by Shubh. He talks about, can each of you kindly outline what concrete, daily observed felt value of liberal democracy can be to an individual? And I think that's where I would like you all to end with your final comments, talking about how do these values sort of impact individuals? How do you even if it's not necessarily instrumental from an economic point of view, there is an intrinsic value to them. And I want you to sort of talk about that, both of you. Nitin, beginning with you.
See, I think for me, it's very simple. For the last 70 years, from 26 January 1950, we have overturned centuries of inequity in terms of a hierarchical society. Today, anybody in India is notionally a political equal of everyone else. And there's no contestation of that. And I have seen how empowering that can be. Of course, there are large numbers of people who are not equally empowered. The empowerment is in a spectrum. I am probably fortunate to be more empowered than the others, but the arc of empowerment is spreading by the day. And that is something really, really which I'm proud of.
Will?
Well, I think that, I think the value of liberal democracy is felt in a million ways. I mean, people have, as we've spoken of, there are all those instrumental factors. People enjoy a level of wealth they wouldn't otherwise enjoy. They enjoy a level of freedom and a lack of constraint that they otherwise wouldn't enjoy. But the difficulty is that people don't necessarily attribute it to liberal democracy, right? Like you can feel the effects of something, but not know what the cause is. And I think part of our task is to reconnect the cause to the effects, because I think people have forgotten that their understanding of the way the things that they value are supported by liberal democratic institutions, their sense of that connection is waned and faded. And so we have a lot of work to do to reinforce people's understanding of the way that all the things that they want are supported by liberal values and liberal democratic institutions.
All right. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you so much, Nitin. This has been an engaging and fascinating conversation about an important and urgent subject that we all need to sort of ponder over more. And like Will, you said, it's important to ascribe these successes that we've had and the prosperity that people are enjoying to these values for us to sort of propagate them further. Because if we don't do that, we sort of run the risk of going down a very dark, slippery slope. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you so much, Nitin. And thank you so much, everybody, for participating actively. I'm sorry we couldn't take a lot of the questions because there were quite a few of them, but I've tried to sort of address all the themes that everybody talked about. Folks, do join us next week on the 15th. We have the second in the series of conversations. That's about free markets. What does economic prosperity look like in a post-pandemic world? And you can register for that on either Niskanen's website or through Takshashila's website. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day, Will. Have a good evening, Nitin.
Thanks,
Nitin. Manoj, it was great. It was a pleasure.